It's now red.
Frank Whelan.
Okay. Thank you so much, folks, for coming tonight. Appreciate it. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the Liberty Bell and some myths and other things that have gathered around it over the years before it was the Liberty Bell. And I have to take us back to the year 1777, fall. The members of the Continental Congress had a great deal on their mind that year. We must all hang together, or assuredly we shall all hang separately. So said Benjamin Franklin at the signing of the Declaration of Independence in 1776. Franklin was safely off in France trying to negotiate an alliance, but the others who heard these words were reminded that when the British Army came marching into Philadelphia, they would be more than just words. Many of them were lawyers and knew full well that the penalty for high treason, without having to look it up in their copy of Sir William Blackstone's Commentaries of the Laws of England, that called them very solemn and terrible. The traitor would be taken to a place of execution. Then they would be hanged by the neck and cut down alive. While still conscious, their entrails would be taken out before their eyes. Decapitation would follow, and their bodies divided into 4 parts. It was up to the monarch to decide what happened to the remains, in other words, drawn and quartered. And that's where we get that from. In England, their heads were mounted on pikes and placed atop London Bridge, where the birds would peck at them and offer a ghastly reminder of the punishment of their high treason crime. If George III so decided, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and John Adams, among others, would have suffered a similar fate. You could see why their minds would be concentrated. And it did not stop there. Family members would see the forfeiture of their property to the state. Their heirs would be forbidden from ever owning property or conducting business. Another big worry for Congress was the state of the Continental Army. Washington had lost the Battle of Long Island. He had lost at Brandywine, and in October would lose at Germantown. Yes, he had won at Trenton, but that was almost a year ago. Now, Washington was thinking of retreating again, perhaps to Bethlehem, 50 miles to the north. The chief reason he decided to stay at Valley Forge, according to historian E.A. Zucker, was that the Philadelphia City Fathers threatened to withdraw their support of his army if he moved further than 30 miles north from the occupied city. Some in Congress were seriously thinking that the Virginian was just not up to the job and should be replaced. Why wasn't he attacking the British instead of just sitting there and waiting for them? The distressed, threadbare state of his ill-equipped army against the best trained and best equipped soldiers in the world, that was Washington's daily reality, seemed to have escaped them. Horatio Gates, a former British officer, was a rising star, particularly with John Adams. At least he wasn't one of those shifty Frenchmen who came around looking for commissions in office. This Lafayette was a nice, sincere young man, but the rest of them, later they would discover that Gates was a disaster waiting to happen, and that it was not clear until 1780 when he lost a debacle of a battle and fled Camden, South Carolina. Adams, who apparently never really could forgive Franklin for leaving his beloved Boston for that sinkhole of depravity, Philadelphia, suggested the good doctor, a widower, was having too much fun over there in Paris, quote, dallying with the missies and courtesans of the French court. His exact words, instead of getting Louis XVI's ministers down to business, as a good New Englander would, of course. That winter, Adams, after passing through the Lehigh Valley in a blizzard, left for Paris, sent by Congress to keep an eye on Franklin. He would be humiliated on his arrival to hear the good doctor had negotiated and signed a treaty of alliance in France without Adams' assistance. With all these things to think about, it is difficult to imagine that as they prepared to flee first to Lancaster and then to York, with a stop in Bethlehem, the Continental Congress had time to be concerned with seemingly lesser things. And one was when they ordered that the Philadelphia bells, the State House bell and all the city's church bells be removed from the city and taken to a place of safety. That place was to be the Lehigh Valley, 50 miles to the north. Pennsylvania German farmers who regularly came down to the city to market would carry them to Northampton, now Allentown. Apparently, no written orders that survive were given as to exactly where the bells should be hidden. They left that to the people's imagination, apparently. But according to a long-standing oral tradition, later backed by historical research, Zion's Church was chosen for the State House bell, today known as the Liberty Bell. That is what the Shrine Museum honors. It might seem strange that bells were such a priority, but at the same time, the art of bell making was shared with that of cannon making. Same materials, same tools. Melt down bells, and if you were skillful enough, you could create artillery. More than likely, that was what motivated the removal of the city of Philadelphia's bells in 1777, with the British Army at its doorstep. And it was not the well-equipped British that needed the cannon. It was the Americans who wanted to melt them down if it became necessary. In fact, according to some historians, if the United States had not concluded its alliance with France and thus assured its supply of artillery, the Liberty Bell and the city church bells and the rest of the city's metal that was movable would indeed have been melted down for cannon. Washington understood the problem from the start. When he first got command of the army in Boston, the British were solidly reinforcing their own army in Boston. Without artillery, he could see no way to dislodge them. His army was no match for them. The terrible state we lie in, he wrote to a letter to his brother, is exceedingly disagreeable. Washington, being an 18th century man, that was saying something pretty strong. The only way out Washington could think of was get the cannon from Fort Ticonderoga, New York, recently taken from the British, and take them through 300 miles of wilderness to Boston. Henry Knox, a former bookseller from Boston, and his artillery chief took up the task. Knox traveled to the fort, picked 58 of the most useful artillery pieces, and had them disassembled with the aid of Benedict Arnold and Ethan Allen, and assembled across strong sleds of nearly 3 tons each, 80 oak of oxen, and then dragged them across frozen lake and mountain trails to Boston, 300 miles. Although Knox and his crew had to spend at least one day outside Albany fishing an 18-pounder from the Hudson River, in January, they arrived in the hills over Boston. Met with artillery fire, stunned British generals announced 3 days later they would leave Boston. A week later, they did so, along with thousands of loyalists, a.k.a. Tories, for Nova Scotia. But if it got the British out of Boston in 1775, it also showed that artillery was to be the most important arm that Washington's army needed and how difficult it would be to get it. Gunpowder and cannonballs were also in short supply. On Christmas Eve of 1775, Washington wrote, "Our want of gunpowder is inconceivable." By 1777, colonial ironworks were doing the best they could to meet the demand. Church bells were the primary source of cannon melted from New York. When forced to retreat from New York, Washington ordered the church bells in Manhattan to be taken down from his defeat, following in August 1776 Battle of Long Island. In this, he was backed up by the local authorities, the provincial Congress, who said they must be preserved for our state so that we may have them to melt them down to provide, quote, the sinews of war, unquote. This is the colonial officials. So they're saying, colonial officials in New York are saying we have to melt down the bells to make cannon, and that's what we have to do. On June 16, 1777, the Pennsylvania Assembly, meeting in what is now Independence Hall, authorized that, quote, as soon as they may think proper, the officials remove all the bells belonging to the several churches and other public buildings, also be removed to a place of safety. On September 14, 1777, the British only days away, the Continental Congress called on military and public officials to remove, quote, all bells in Philadelphia to a place of public security on the near approach of the enemy to the city. And the enemy was only about 4 or 5 days away. On the same day, the Supreme Executive Council of Philadelphia ordered all papers and documents be turned over to, quote, wagoners, unquote, to be taken to Easton. Church rectors from Philadelphia's Christ Church were very concerned that the removal of the bells in haste would damage them and the belfries so concerned they were by the damage might be done to the belfries that they asked to be exempt from this order. The authorities promised the bells would be removed carefully, but they must be removed. And they went. On the morning of September 23rd, 1777, in occupied Philadelphia, Elizabeth Drinker, a Quaker lady, awoke to an oddly silent city. Ye bells of ye city are certainly taken away, she wrote in her diary. As the wagons creaked northward on crowded roads, they were probably taken by night. Later artists have enjoyed depicting the future Liberty Bell upright in the back of the wagon, and I'm thinking of something over at the Lehigh County Historical Society with the big wall murals, and there it is up there, the Liberty Bell standing out for all the Tories in the countryside to see, knowing exactly where it's going. So they creaked northward. Later artists have enjoyed depicting this future for it. Common sense suggested that they were hidden in some ways from the prying eyes of Tories, but no one can say for sure. Despite the breakdown in the wagon with the Liberty Bell in Bethlehem, the bells were rested in the church underground. Above in the church, wounded soldiers were cared for. On February 6, 1778, the alliance treaty with France was signed. It took some time, but the news finally arrived in America. According to John Bear Stout, author of a detailed history of that time, it was that treaty which saved the State House bell to become the Liberty Bell. So we can thank Benjamin Franklin a great deal for what we have here today. The establishment of the alliance between the colonies and France made them further attempts to manufacture cannon at Carlisle, which is Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which is the arms and weapons depot, unnecessary, which apparently was the destination of the bells and the brass that was moved from Philadelphia. French cannon of all types began arriving. American cannon makers modified some of them under Knox's direction to suit the needs of the Army for a lighter weapon, but others were used as they were sent. Training artillery units was particularly difficult, for it was necessary to aiming a cannon properly and required a higher mathematical knowledge, like calculus, to judge trajectory and range, knowledge beyond what most ordinary soldiers and citizens possessed. With the evacuation of Philadelphia by the British in the summer of 1778, the following fall, the bells were returned to the city. A document from October 22nd, 1778, from Christ Church states that the church bells have been returned and hung on the governor's expense. Drinker also notes their return in her diary. The State House Independence Hall belfry was in such bad shape that the Liberty Bell was put in storage until repairs could be made. It was safely rehung in 1785. Over time, different traditions have developed over what exactly the purpose was for removing the Philadelphia's bells from the British occupation of the city in 1777. In 1876, at the centennial of the Revolution, stories began to appear in Harper's Weekly and other publications and gained popular currency at that time. It was argued that the bells were removed so that the British would not melt them down and use them as bullets. Later versions elaborated on that theme. Americans, it was said, removed the bells because they did not want the remains of the icon of liberty destroyed and fired back against them by a vengeful redcoats. Others, like Stout, believe that was cannon that Washington needed at the time, and the bells probably removed for that purpose to provide cannon for the Army. There is no official blanket statement saying one way or the other on what the plan was, we are left to assume. But the fact that Washington felt artillery was essential for victory and that bells at that time were regularly melted down for cannon is indisputable. As far back as the Middle Ages, the practice was common. During the wars of the French Revolution in the 1790s, for example, the bells of venerable Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris were melted down for cannon. During the Civil War, towns all over the Confederate States, some voluntarily, others by official order, had their church bells melted down for the same reason. It is also possible that Washington wanted to melt the bells down as bullets for his army, although the State House bell would become a national icon as a Liberty Bell in the 19th century by abolitionists. No one thought of it that way in 1777-78, especially the British. They had plenty of ammunition, and apparently from the evidence of their time in Philadelphia, no interest in pursuing, in a little Ice Age winter, Washington's troops at Valley Forge, which could have quickly ended the Revolution with a British victory, much less wandering 50 miles north to seize the bells in Allentown. So the State House bell has survived. Today we have it, crack and all, and it has a long and fruitful life as the Liberty Bell. Thank you very much. Any questions? I'll be glad to answer them. Yes?
Is there anything to the fact that Washington had a misinformation campaign going on regarding the location of the bells from Philadelphia?
He could have done that. I know he had spies and people like that on his staff who could informally spread those kind of rumors. But I have not seen anything written on that specific.
Is it possible that, and is that where the rumor were kind of thrown into the Delaware comes from and all that?
Yeah, I think so. Well, the Delaware, that's interesting. You should get into that. When they were talking about bringing the papers to Easton, the official papers, somebody also said, well, maybe we should take them to the Delaware, take the bells to the Delaware. But there's absolutely no truth to that. And first of all, you put them in the Delaware. That would be kind of silly. It was just something that, was that a disinformation campaign? You have to understand, Philadelphia, this is a war zone. Like, a lot of people don't seem to understand that. They look back at that time with all these ladies in frilly dresses and all these men in wonderful clothes, and the revolution was inevitable and it was always going to happen and we're going to be free tomorrow. No, it didn't work that way. The country was full of people who thought the revolution was the most horrible idea they could have ever imagined and wanted the British to stay there, and their whole lives were faced around that reality. And they didn't like George Washington. They hated them. They thought they were the traitors. Not them. They were the traitors. To them, they were the traitors. So a lot of people at that time felt, the whole thing was all up in the air, because it was all up in the air. And that's one thing, as a historian, I think is crucial to keep in mind when you're looking at history, is that they don't know yet what's going to happen. George Washington, they signed the Declaration of Independence. They didn't know what was going to happen to them. They could have been hanged, like I was pointing out. Anything could have happened. The whole country could have been totally different. France and Spain, when they signed up to be allies with us, they weren't doing it out of the goodness of their hearts. They weren't doing it out of love of liberty. France was an absolute monarchy, so was Spain. They had their own agendas that they kept hidden, and they had their own spies. They had their own people in Congress who they paid to keep track of the votes that were going on, congressional members who were taking. Yeah, they did. They did. And the Comte de Vergennes, who was the French foreign minister, was informed of what was going on in Congress almost as soon as Congress did it, considering the transportation problems. But no, this was all very much up in the air. And so when we think about the Liberty Bell and the State House Bell and everything else, think about these folks in that time period. The British are coming. They're taking over the city. We don't know what they're going to do. Fortunately for them, the British were ruled by Commander General William Howe. Let's just say he was not the most aggressive general in the British Army. And there is a story that, and it was based on some fact, that he spent most of his time during the occupation seeing his lady friend, who was the wife of the quartermaster, and she was known among the men of the British Army as the Sultana, and they were often seen together. Well, Mrs. Howe was over in England, and it's a long way. Anyway, so, and it was his mistress, and he really didn't want to. It almost appeared as if he didn't. He basically thought, we've captured the capital, that's it. We've captured the capital city, and so they're going to come to us. We come, say, we've got your capital city. Hey, we're winning, right? Everybody, come on. Okay, Congress, you come negotiate with us, and we'll work out a deal where we maybe not chop your heads off. And so, but no, they didn't do that. They didn't do that. And so that was a real surprise. And there's a very interesting story. The day after Philadelphia fell to the British, was occupied by the British, the Comte de Vergennes went to Benjamin Franklin, and he said, Mr. Franklin, the British have taken Philadelphia. And Franklin said, I'm afraid your lordship is wrong. The Philadelphia has taken the British. And it did. They did. They had a great time. There was a great party they had when they left Philadelphia called the Meschianza, with a big floral knights and flat. They left Philadelphia in like they'd won. They acted like, hey, we won, but we're going to go to New York now because it's better, and besides that, who knows, it's closer and whatever. But it was that was the situation. That was the situation, and that was the situation.
Was Valley Forge the turning point then?
Well, Valley Forge was very important because it enabled the Americans to recoup. Baron von Steuben was able to train them. He was an old Prussian. He understood the value of having a trained army. A lot of these, you have to understand, a lot of these folks in the American Continental Army were not. We have these Walt Disney versions of, hey, hey, ho, ho, we're going to hit with the guns. The British are stupid and we'll shoot them. No, these poor people, they were very good. They made very good marksmen, very good shots, many of them, but they were poor and they were not trained in fighting British armies. British armies were very disciplined. British armies were up to you and bang, right on top of you, bang, 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 and they didn't have any cannon. So this was very important, Chris, because they did give them a chance to reorganize themselves, and that was the most important thing. And General Howe, by the way, was under a great deal of pressure from England because he didn't do anything, and they asked him to come back, and he did ahead of time, and they sent General Clinton from New York, a real hard case military guy, to get that straighten up and fly right British Army in Philadelphia up to New York. But that was what was going on. It was a time, and the Liberty Bell was here all that time, and safe from here, and so we have that to be thankful for.
Yeah, I have one more question.
Sure.
Wasn't this area big in iron works? In Caddy, wasn't there the Thomas Iron Works?
That stuff doesn't come until the 19th century.
Oh, it's
That's
another
not
century.
to the 19th century.
Oh.
New Jersey had some ironworks. There's the Hopewell iron furnace, but the iron production at that period was a lot different than it became in the 19th century. They didn't have coal. They didn't have anthracite coal. That won't be used for creating iron around here till 1840, when David Thomas comes from Wales. So the iron furnaces here were powered by wood. You used the wood. They called them iron plantations. There was acres of them, and you chop down trees and you burn the wood to get the iron hot. But there was only so much you could do with that. As making cannon was a very difficult procedure. Cannon were mostly bronze, by the way. There were iron cannons, but most of them were bronze. And one of the reasons for the bronze was, interestingly, was because when they blew up, as sometimes happened, they went in fragments rather than blowing up whole and wiping out a lot of people. Iron was more unstable. So most of the cannon were bronze. And that was a very, very important factor. And it was you had to really know what you were doing to make a cannon. You couldn't just you put it down on the ground, you poured the hot metal in, you did that, all those things. And there's very good website online that goes into this whole thing with quite a bit of detail about how they actually did build those, how they built those cannons. And it was a process in America. Well, first of all, America had been forbidden. The British said, you can have iron furnaces, but you can't make cannon. You can't make cannon. So even before the Revolution, they'd already set that down. You can't make cannon, and the Americans had to do it surreptitiously. William Allen, before he became a Tory, when the Revolution started, he was all for the colonial clause. He had an iron furnace in New Jersey. They made cannonballs. Cannonballs they could do. Cannons were a whole other trick kind of thing. So that's when I look at this thing and I see the argument that's been made over the years, understandably and with good reason, and it's quite possible, it's plausible, but that it was an article, it was things that was created way back in the 19th century, and that was what developed. And so I feel from the research that I've done and the research that's out there that cannon were primarily what they were trying to make, and that's what they wanted to melt the Liberty Bell down for.
We know who made the Liberty Bell.
Oh, Pass and Stowe in Philadelphia.
Oh, right.
Their names are up
Oh,
here.
yeah, Parsons.
And the Liberty Bell, of course, has this great long story. And they went back and it broke a couple times. They had to redo it, and they sent it to England, and that didn't work. But by the 1750s, it was pretty good, and so they were working. And it probably rang. And there's this whole debate: did it ring during the signing of the Declaration of Independence? They now say yes. They believe. Most scholars say they probably did. But it was not in great shape even then because of the belfry. The belfry was wood. It was rotting. It was out in the air. It was rotting. And they used to bring it all the time. In those days, cities ran by bells. You had to understand that. They ran by the bells. In the morning, people knew when to get up for work. They heard the city bell. They heard the city bell going off. Then at lunchtime, they knew when lunch because of the bells going off. And then they go to also time 6 o'clock. Okay, the bell 6 o'clock time to go off. And it had been that way since the Middle Ages. It had been that way in England for a long time. Church bells set the time for the people who didn't have watches, which were most of the population. And there were some big clocks in town, but they were propelled by the bells usually. So that's why bells were so important to the vast majority of people in those days. Okay. Well, if anybody's... Yes, Dennis.
Just to support what you were saying, that Charles Thompson, you've heard of him?
Yes.
So he had a home out down Bryn Mawr, Harrington House. It's still there, but I heard, well, I went there because my relative was there, that when Charles Thompson left Philadelphia, because when you said they evacuated, my relative moved in and occupied that place.
Oh, great. Fantastic. Great historic home. Yeah, it must have been nice. Yes, Dennis.
Yeah, I'm thinking that the bells were brought here during the day, at night. We have pictures here. It looks like it's during the day.
Right.
But then we have those people that are loyal to England, and we didn't want people to know about.
Right.
I mean, they couldn't get on their cell phone and call anybody, but the word get around that the bells were hidden here. Was Washington interested in knowing the bells where the bells were? So if they needed the metal, they could get it.
I think that at that time, it was in February that the alliance with France was signed. So, but Washington probably, we would have to wait. What would have happened in the spring or summer of 1778 if there was no response from France? If no agreement had been reached? What would have happened? Would they have definitely gone to Carlisle and be melted down for cannon? Possibly. Possibly. But we just don't know. It's one of those great unknowns of history. We don't know what would, but it probably would have. I mean, they were doing that otherwise. They were trying, there were iron places in the Pennsylvania, mostly Pennsylvania and New Jersey, that were trying to make cannon, and they did make some, but it was a very slow process for them because it was just something they were just not able to appreciate. It was a slow-moving technology, It's not like these things, fast-moving technology, slow-moving technology. They just things didn't happen rapidly.
But then what about the citizenry? I mean, word have gotten around that perhaps.
Well, it's interesting. It's possible they did. It's possible they knew. But did they know enough? Did they know enough about it to say positively? Maybe the bells were brought in at night, and they came in, brought them in, and people were talking about it, and Pastor Blummer just told them in 21st century argument, dummy up. Don't say anything to anybody. Keep it quiet.
Bloomer was the pastor.
Pastor here, yes, and a very strong supporter of independence. And so I think that they probably understood it at that level. James Allen, in his diary, writes, the road in front of my house, which is the road the Liberty Bell would have taken up from Philadelphia, is become the busiest highway in North America. So troops were moving back and forth. Everything was happening on that road. Who knows? That he looked out the window. He had you could just. Sometimes I like to think about this going past Trout, visualizing James Allen with his little telescope. What's going on? What's going on? And because he was trying to be neutral, he hoped he could be neutral, but he couldn't. But many people didn't want him to be neutral, so that was it. Yeah, would there? Well, also too, what would have happened if the bells were here? Who was going to take them? First of all, the British Army wasn't interested. They weren't coming up here to try and get them. So if you went to General Howe, the Americans are hiding the Liberty Bell, hiding the bells up here in Allentown. It's horrible. You got to come up. And Allentown, he said, calm down. Sultana, can you come over here? Come on. This guy's a little bit confused. Right. And I think that they they might have known something was going on, but they didn't know what, and they couldn't say for sure. And they didn't want to be the person who said it, because there were a lot of people who might have known about it who might not have treated them too kindly if they attempted. But, like I say, the British weren't that interested. Well, there's a great story. I'll go a little bit. There was a group of Tory scouts, or whatever you want to call them, who were in Trent at New Hope, and they tried to let the commander of the Hessian troops in Trenton, they tried to get him to get his troops to go, and they said, Washington's crossing, Washington's crossing over, he's going to come in and confront you. And it was Christmas Day night, and he was it was a good German fellow, Colonel Rahl, and he was playing euchre with the guys, and when Colonel Rahl refused to see him after 5 or 6 attempts, he sent a note to Colonel Rahl, and Colonel Rahl took a look, put it in his pocket, and the next morning he was in the arms of the American Army. So, those kind of things happen in history, and that's what's going on here. And it was a small town, and everybody knew everybody, and so probably Dennis, they probably didn't. They knew it was here, but did they know it was here? There's one thing you know officially, and to know by rumor. And so we don't know.
Do we have the exact route? I've mentioned this to you before, the roads, they went over King's Highway. Well, we know that
Right.
Avenue was once called King's Highway, and then Frank, we talked, and most roads were called King's Highway.
Right.
How'd they get across the Lehigh River? Did they go across the Little Lehigh someplace?
They would have, they crossed the Little thing. You have to understand also the Lehigh River and the Little Lehigh in those days were not the Lehigh River and Little Lehigh River we know today. Little Lehigh Creek we know today. They were usually full of stones. They're very narrow, very difficult. One of the things that frustrated poor William Allen is he created Allentown because he thought the great trade route up from Canada down and bring everything down along the river down to Philadelphia, the furs, the Indians, it'll work. Because you can't do that. The river was just full of stone. It was considered so awkward that many years later, when Josiah White and Erskine Hazard wanted to build the Lehigh Canal, and they asked for control of the river, the state legislature gave it to them, and one legislator said, "We're giving you the right to ruin yourselves, because nobody's going to get anything going down the Lehigh River. It was a mess. Because no transportation. So chances are good they just went back around. The roads were a lot different than we think they were. I mean, the maps were, they went more by Indian trails and things like that. They had ways of knowing how to do that, I'm sure. Sure. I can't tell you more. That's what I'm saying.
Wouldn't the farmers who went to market instantly regularly
Right.
had a pretty distinct route?
Right, they would have had a general route up, we do know, but we don't know exactly for sure, and this is an argument that's been going on off and on with the historians. What was the exact route? What was the exact route? A number of years ago, when I was working for the Call, we did a Liberty Bell route map back in the 80s, which was very nice. You remember? Yeah, okay. And Ken Rainier, who was our artist at the time, was one of the people who was working on that. And he and I were talking about this, and it was like, well, where did they go? How did they go? And we kept asking, went from one source to another, and one source said, well, they got up to Montgomery County, and then they went up into, I mean, we know the wagon broke down in Bethlehem, because the Moravian Diary says so. What route they took from Montgomery County up through there, we don't know. For sure. We have an idea, we can assume, but assume, historians aren't supposed to assume, right? So,
Our friends in the Quakertown say that the Liberty Bell slept there.
could be,
They stopped there, and they have
could be,
a building and,
could be, very well be.
So it
Could
went from Bethlehem to Quakertown?
It could be. In those days, the road, they were going through the places that were populated. Quakertown wasn't much in the 1770s. It was actually called Charleston or something like that, or Charlestown or something like that. But it was not, but it could have passed through, and the farmers could have supported him. And then if there were Tories in the countryside, they could have, well, Bucks County was a hotbed of Toryism. They didn't know this whole revolutionary thing was not their thing. And so they were really, that whole area there was full of people who thought this Revolutionary War was just that, treason against the king, your lawful, your dread and sovereign lord, and who could hang you up and drag you up, hang you up when he felt like it. So people, I think they're like with everything else. They were divided. They were deeply divided about which side. John Adams said he divided up into thirds. There was a third people who supported the revolution, a third of the people who were against the revolution, and the great majority who just wanted to keep out of it, who didn't want to get themselves involved in a war. But they just kept their mouths shut. After the revolution, estimated between 80,000 and 100,000 people went to Canada from this country. Yes, because they were going to live under the king. And many of these people were loyal officials. There were sheriffs. They were municipal mayors. There were people like that. And they just felt they wanted to live in a land ruled by the British and have the British flag fly over them. And they had sworn an oath. They had sworn an oath to the king. William Allen, say what you like about him back and forth, but he, as a justice of the Pennsylvania Colonial Court, had sworn an oath to uphold the king's laws. And if you moved against that, you were undermining the whole structure of the law. One of the major reasons why Allen supported the whole thing basically was because he owned huge amounts of land. Huge amounts of land. All that land was based on British law, colonial law. And if that was undermined and the American and the whole new loose system came in, he would be bankrupt. And he was. He ended up bankrupt. He ended up dying bad, broke, William Allen.
William Allen,
Yeah.
over in England.
No, right here
Oh, well,
in Germantown. As a matter of fact, there's stories that no one knows where his grave is.
oh,
And he supposedly, according to one source, he was buried in the road in front of his home in Germantown. He had a summer home, Mount Airy. And he supposedly so that the colonialists couldn't dig his body up and deface it. So he was, that's where he supposedly is buried. Now, nobody knows exactly where. The rest of his family went to England, or like James Allen, died before they got a chance to leave.
yeah, it's like,
But yeah.
Do you have any comment about the man who claims to have information, an alternative narrative, and is going to publish a book? Any thoughts about that?
I'm looking forward to reading his book.
what do you mean he has alternative?
This is this gentleman that
For Frank
I've
probably
spoken
knows
to him
more
several
than I
times.
do.
Yeah, I spoke to him. Mr. Billig, yeah. He actually contacted me back at the morning call. We went around in circles. I wanted to see his information. He wouldn't share it because he's writing his book, and that was in the 1980s. So if he's writing his book, it ought to be a humdinger. He's been doing it for a long while now.
He claims that all of his sources are a matter of public record,
Okay,
but he would not reveal any of them to me on the phone.
we're all a matter of public
So,
record,
you know,
right, sure,
to me,
okay.
I look forward to reading it too and seeing.
See if what you can prove, you know? Lay your cards on the table.
What's the premise of the book?
The
That,
premise is that the Bells never came here, that they went to Carlisle.
oh.
That's his theory.
Well, if he thinks they went to Carlisle, perhaps, you know, they were planned to go to Carlisle, but they never went there, and that's what we know. So if he thinks,
But he says some crazy things like the bell count is all wrong in the wagons, and I'm like, are you sure you have the right wagon train?
yeah, right, I know. Well, if so, if Mr. Billig had come forward with this, he could be declared as one of the greatest historians of the period and totally upend all historical theory and make a lot of people very nervous. But no, he hasn't done it, you know?
I tend to think that if your source is extant public materials, then there's no reason to not cite them because nobody can steal your thunder.
Thunder, right, exactly, if they're
And
out there.
If your source material is something fresh and new, like an 18th century diary or whatever, then I can understand why you wouldn't want to share them, but you still have to authenticate them.
Authenticate
On
them,
some
right,
level.
Patrick.
And if you're not willing to either present your authentication or share any, I don't know, it seems to me.
Well, on the phone, in my conversation, I said, what are you afraid of? And he didn't answer.
Yeah, what is he afraid of? You know, some people are like that.
He's
What
right,
can
he's
I
right.
tell you?
We're all nuts here.
Right, exactly. Then we're doing the wrong thing, and you know we're not. He's legitimate, and we aren't. But in his head, he has this, and so that's fine. I mean,
Is it in our archives that they were here? I mean,
we know that because for a long, long time it was passed down from family to family, and finally we know that when the Liberty Bell, they dug and they found the spot probably where it was. We know those things. We know that there was down here someplace in this building, but then the different types of building, you know, so. Or maybe they hid it someplace, you know, that's the story, but that's what we believe, based on what the information we have.
What we also know from the Moravian diary
Yeah,
is
is
that
it-
it went from Bethlehem to
Allentown, right.
to
So it came here,
Northampton.
so it came here sometime, at some
Came
point.
here, and this was one of the few public buildings that wasn't controlled by the Tories, is that correct, Frank?
It pretty much wasn't controlled by the Allens. There weren't many public buildings around. The Allens were down in Philadelphia most of the time, or James Allen chose to live here because he had a thing that, and his daughter, Ann Penn Allen Greenleaf, she always contended, and we have the account of a gentleman who spoke with her on this in the 1840s before she passed away, and she said, my father was the person who founded Allentown, not his father. William Allen drew up a map. It was my father, James Allen, who really founded Allentown. And he doesn't get any credit for it, but that's what really happened. So that was,
interesting.
So Pastor Jeff, to answer your question, there may be, but until he decides to tell us, we don't know.
right, exactly.
And we have to go on as though the world spins here until at such a time that it doesn't spin.
I also had a question or a thought about how do you move a, 2-ton, 1-ton bell from a wagon into a church? Is this block and tackle, ramps?
Probably.
Wait,
Oh, there.
I can answer that question.
That's you.
Aha.
I can answer that question. And it starts with this photo, which is actually, or this picture, which is actually incorrect. You see these windows at the bottom here? I'll show the camera.
Go ahead.
These windows at the bottom here, there's 5 of them, right? Well, we have a contemporary woodcut from the 18th century. We have a picture of it in the Allentown history book, where it shows window, window, door, window, window.
So there was a door.
You put it on its side, you roll it in the door. You only need, I measured it, I think you only need like you don't, it's not as wide as you may think.
Right.
I forget what the measurement was, but you could get it through a doorway because they used this space for storage during the winter, for food, that sort of things, food
Potatoes.
stores, potatoes, and this window was actually a doorway. And if you get it on the ground, you roll it under, you close the door, you cover it up with some canvas. There you go.
I think people, when they come and look at our mural over there, think that they brought it right up to the front door and took it inside and lifted the floorboards up and put it underneath.
Right, I think that you're right, Dennis.
Story.
The story is yeah.
We were on a slope, as we are today.
Right.
Went down the side, went in the side door, hid it underneath the floorboard. Hey, floorboards. But that story, it's just.
It's interesting, yeah. It's,
What's in your mind? And one more question, Frank.
Yes.
We know that the bell that was brought to Lehigh Valley, and I just heard you say it to Bethlehem. The story that we heard for many years here was that there was no room for the bell in Bethlehem, so they were brought to Allentown. Is that correct, or is that incorrect?
well, that might be correct because most of the Moravian buildings were occupied by dead and dying soldiers. They were all hospitals being used. Washington, after the Battle of Germantown, after the Battle of the Brandywine, of course, Lafayette recuperated from the Battle of Brandywine or either Germantown or Brandywine, in a house in Bethlehem. So, but those big Moravian, the Brethren House, built a house 200 people, had 500 people in them. And also, that big space, the Moravian space where the old mill is, and they showed you that, and the creek runs through there, and it's so bucolic and wonderful. It actually was full of tents with people dying in the snow. It was not a pleasant place, and it was very unpleasant. I know because I did a story on it a while back. These people, they found some soldiers. They found their soldiers, and they probably were buried early because they actually had coffins that they were buried in with. They assumed that was the case because they looked like they were done for some officers, probably in 1776, 1777 period. And then when the battles around Philadelphia, the British Army came through, and the Germantown and Brandywine and these things, and those troops were moved on. And then, of course, they died of disease. They died of huge numbers of disease. Nobody knew dying. We have accounts from doctors who were there that basically said everybody just died. They were there, and they said they tried very hard. The Moravians tried very hard to help. They did an awful lot of good to try and help, but there's not. What can you do if you don't know that there's a germ theory of disease? If you refuse to accept the germ theory of disease, like some people do today, then you have problems with it. So yeah, and if they were returned to the soil. They were not buried with coffins at all. They were just.
And our church was used as a hospital.
Hospitals, a military hospital in upstairs, and it must have been interesting. Did they have pews? What did they do? Where did they put them? There's a whole interesting thing. How was this place used as a military hospital? How was it used as in that? I mean, what kind of doctors did they have? I imagine they had. I know they had one or two very good ones here, at least educated in Europe. Some's in Germany and one in England. But but the vast number of people, they didn't have enough doctors. And the medicine was very primitive, so you couldn't do much for the guys anyway. Yes, sir.
So over in God's Acre, right here, by the Moravian,
Right.
Single Brother House, God's Acre, they have surgeons that died,
Mhm.
From typhoid and all that other stuff. Trying to help the guys that were laying on straw, just
Yes.
straw.
Yeah, they did, and they did work very hard. Washington basically had Benjamin Rush, or I think it was Benjamin Rush, basically come to send a letter to the Moravians saying, I had hoped not to have to send this to you, tell you this, but here you have it, or this is what I have, but I'm afraid I must. We need to take over your buildings. We need to take over your Moravian buildings. And what could the Moravians do? Say no? I mean, they weren't about to do that. They had enough trouble trying to keep a balance between which side they were on. You know, a lot of people around here were like the Moravians, you know, and they're kind of, because the Moravians had a deal that went way back with the British government, basically saying you have a right to convert the Indians. And the Moravians were very upset when the revolution broke out because that would cut them off from their right to preach to the Indians. If the British won, they could be cut off from that. Yes?
So the right to preach to the Indians, that was not a given?
No. The British, in the areas that the British controlled, first of all, there was the problem with the French, and after the French and Indian War, then the British took over all that property, and the native tribes with them. And so we will not let you go into those territories without clearance. And that goes way back. That goes back before the French and Indian War.
So is it a matter of they didn't want people going into those territories, or they didn't want people proselytizing?
They didn't want people going into those territories because they had a great deal going with the Indians. You give us your furs, we'll give you the rum, and everybody will be happy. And then you have the Hudson's Bay Company and all these other big things in England who are getting all these furs coming through. And the last thing they wanted was Americans coming up there, because Americans had a tendency, they wanted to get land. And this totally upset the whole concept of what the British wanted to do, which was get furs and keep the fur trade going. And so they want to hope the Native Americans would just keep going. You know, they didn't want that. They were allied to the tribes. And so the Iroquois, the British they were very close with the Iroquois. I have an old map at home, a reproduction of a map that says, on a map was written in London, and it said, the Iroquois, hearty friends of ye English. So that was what they wanted. And the Native Americans wanted to keep that relationship, and the British fur people wanted to keep that relationship too. And here's Americans, they want to settle the land, they want to move the Indians off, they want to have farms. Not working, you know, different way of thinking. Any questions? Okay, well, thank you, folks.
And yet there were massacres and all that.
Yes, there were massacres. There were definitely massacres. There was a...
Frank, can you confirm for me that when they dug up 378, they found where they buried the guys over in Bethlehem that were dying over there in the hospital?
Yeah, that was done. There was I did a story on that. They did find those bodies there in Bethlehem, and near 378. Yes, and they were the ones that were in the coffins, and they were digging. They had some digging going on there at first to widen that area, and the crew was digging it, was surprised that a skeleton fell out, and they thought, "What is this? What is this? Was there a murder?" And so they called in the state people, and the state the skeleton is long dead, 200 years dead. You're welcome, folks. You're welcome. Thank you very much for coming out tonight.
Well, please have some of our refreshments in the hallway and take some time to look at our current exhibit on the pastors of Zion over the hundreds of years that Zion's Church has been here. Have a good evening. Thank you for coming.
Oh, good. Worked out. Nice question and answer, too.